Now you might be surprised to hear that despite the title of the video, I actually don't really love Sonic Frontiers that much. It's a good game, easily the most enjoyable Sonic game of the last decade, but it has a lot holding it back from matching the heights that the best of the series offer. So, if this is the take that I'm offering to you right here at the start of the video, then how could it possibly have redeemed the series? The obvious thing to say is that it's just flat out better than any Sonic game released after Generations. Sonic Mania is somewhat of an exception, though it's not really a Sonic team game, so it doesn't really count for the purposes of my argument. Plus, it does rely a bit too heavily on the Genesis-era Sonic games for it to have its own distinct identity, even if it is my favorite 2D game in the series. At least for now, we'll have to wait and see for Superstars. Back to the actual topic of the video though, the real reason I titled the video this way is not just because it's more fun than Forces, Lost World, etc., but rather something that I feel is more substantial than this. Something that even if the game was a complete dumpster fire train wreck that wasn't fun even in the slightest amount, would still put it on a pedestal far above the 2010s games. Ambition. Regardless of your take on the post-06 era of Sonic games, I think we can all agree that all the games after Unleashed progressively got more samey and stale. And to understand why this is so important, I must first give a little history lesson on my experience and opinions on the 3D titles. Don't worry, I'll try to keep it as brief as humanly possible. Let's get into how Sonic Frontiers redeemed the franchise. One thing about Sonic that's always equally captivated me and irritated me to no end was how almost every 3D entry tried something different and would experiment with new ideas. It offers a lot more variety between the different entries compared to Zelda and Mario, which generally offer a similar experience, at least up until Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. However, it also means that these different entries differ in quality tremendously. Sonic Adventure hasn't aged that well, but I wouldn't really call it a bad game necessarily. It mostly just feels like it has too many priorities. There's so many different playable characters, each with vastly different playstyles. Sonic is a ton of fun, but the rest are really hit or miss, and even at their best, they don't come even close to the amount of fun that Sonic stages offer. Zelda and Mario definitely add better leaps into the third dimension, setting a precedent for what those series would be for the foreseeable future. The only real difference between 3D World and 64 on a fundamental level is how their levels are designed. Sonic Adventure just doesn't really lay a good foundation for how future entries should be designed. Still though, it's a fairly enjoyable time. Now, Adventure 2 is where it's at, easily my favorite entry in the series. Its narrative balance taking itself seriously as well as being really campy and cheesy, basically flawlessly. The Sonic and Shadow stages are really fun and well designed, and while the other two playstyles aren't quite as fun, I do actually really like them. Also, Cityscape is my favorite song in the series, so that artificially boosts my opinion on it. I absolutely plan on making another video to stagnate the 1,000 other videos on the game in the future, so that's all I'll say here. Sonic Heroes is a pivot turn from the previous two entries, and despite having some frustrating controls and having the process to unlock the final story segment be utterly terrible, and Team Dark and Team Chaotix having some really dull gameplay, I actually really enjoy this game. Its core gameplay is nothing to write home about, but it's still fairly solid. Once you get used to the controls, it's a lot easier to appreciate what the game does well. That's about all I have to say about the game at the present moment. Shadow the Hedgehog is not very good, partly because Shadow says naughty words that will limit my ads on this video, and partly because it's a real chore to play through. But the game does at least have an interesting idea, with you getting to go down a certain story path based on your actions. For a game centered around a character that was only good in like 2 games and then never again, I think it's actually a really cool idea. It's just that the only thing that this game offers is an idea that has execution that's not great. I would like to offer my sincerest apologies to Zach the Mac. For years, he tried to convince me that Sonic 06 is actually a good game. While I still don't like it that much, I've grown to appreciate it more. Underneath the absolute abomination of what we got are some really solid ideas. For one, it handles the multiple playable characters the best in the entire series. Sonic, Shadow, and Silver each have very similar playstyles, but they focus on something different. Sonic is focused on platforming, Shadow is focused on combat, and Silver is focused more on puzzle-related elements. It's like the 3 pieces of the Triforce. Funny Zelda ref. The level design is also pretty solid, and when it all comes together, it can be pretty fun on the odd occasion. It doesn't change how jank it all feels, the empty, boring hub worlds, the irredeemably awful story, but it does help me to see the potential the game has. Whenever I finally get around to playing Project 06, I'll probably consider it one of my favorite Sonic games, and that is the highest praise I can offer 06. I'm gonna be honest with you, I've never actually beaten either of the storybook games. I found them to be really boring and kind of irritating. I especially hate Sonic and the Secret Ring since it took away from the development of 06, and I will never forgive it for that. It's not like they made a fun game to justify it either. The stories are nothing too special, but I will say that it's at least a fun idea. Yeah, that's all I can say since I've never put more than like 3 hours into either game. Now, believe it or not, Sonic 06 was not well received and would come to be known as basically the video game equivalent to the Antichrist. This is the single worst thing that could have happened to the series. The lesson that the Sonic team learned was that taking risks with Sonic was a bad idea, and Sonic Unleashed just proved it. Now, I'll admit the Werehog stages aren't anywhere near as fun as the daytime stages, but I also happen to be one of the 5 people on planet Earth who actually like them. I think their biggest crime is just that they're too long. Otherwise, it's actually a decent time. I also really like the story here, the last Sonic game with a good story. Sonic colors mark the beginning of the end. We just didn't realize it at the time. The story is bland and there's a bit too much of a reliance on 2D sections. It plays everything safe and it leads to a game that's still fun, but it's also very forgettable. The Wisps are a nice addition, but realistically it's the only thing that lets the game stand out, and future entries would use the concept verbatim, so it inadvertently makes the game stand out less. Nothing here feels particularly interesting. I like Sonic Generations. I remember my mom coming home Black Friday 2011 with the cool new shiny Xbox 360 and a copy of this game, so that probably helps improve my opinion on it. It handles the boost formula the best out of any entry that's used it, the platforming is fun, and it acts as a decent trip down memory lane. The story isn't any more complicated than Save Sonic's Friends. Adventure, Adventure 2, and Unleashed have all proven that Sonic does work with more than just a basic platformer story. But because there were 2 games in a row where Sonic Team tried to tell something like that which were both panned, it makes sense that they would play it safe with Sonic in every aspect. Lost World has the worst story in the entire series. It is so bad that it hurts me. No other game in the series makes me as physically embarrassed and full of cringe as any cutscene on display here. And I have to look at myself in the mirror every morning, and that's how you know it's bad. The level design is different from what came before, but it feels like something they did for the sake of it. They don't do a whole lot with it that isn't tedious. There's never really a need to go down another path, and it's not like it's even incentivized that much. It has its moments of enjoyment, and I wouldn't exactly call it a bad game, but I also wouldn't call it a good game. Sonic Boom is the worst entry in the series, and even though it's technically a spin-off, its true undefiled awfulness cannot be overstated. Sonic Forces. You already know the quality of this game. I don't think I've ever felt emptier beating a game in my entire life than when I played this game for the first time. 2017 was a legendary year in gaming, and this was the last game I played that year. If it was released in any other year, it would have still been really mediocre, but it releasing in the year it did really just enhanced how much I didn't care for it. I was cautiously optimistic for the game. That wasn't until I saw Classic Sonic, which is how I knew exactly the kind of game it would be. It would be another Sonic game that plays it safe. Another Sonic game that has potential and squanders it. Another Sonic game that doesn't dare to do anything other than what is merely expected for the series. And what do you know, I was right to lose all faith in the game. It takes a legitimately interesting idea from a premise and does literally nothing with it. The platforming is way too basic. I was one of those Sonic fans who never made OCs or anything, so I don't get a ton of enjoyment out of the character creator. So here we are with my opinion on Sonic at an all-time low. I lost all faith in the series to do anything that would interest me ever again. I couldn't bear it if there was one more bad to mediocre entry in the series. It's safe to say that there was a lot riding on Frontiers for me. The cryptic reveal trailer that was more just saying that a new game existed on the 30th anniversary event was enough to get me somewhat intrigued, and the first proper trailer was more conflicting than anything else. It looked like an Unreal Engine game, but at the same time it's at least something different for the series. Then June 2022 came, and I think it's safe to call it one of the most scuffed and worst ways to reveal game ever. The IGN gameplay demo that first revealed gameplay was borderline painful to watch and made the game look incredibly dull. I wasn't sold. However, I was still really hyped for the game because it just felt like the team was actually trying again, and that just really excited me. And when the game came out, I was pleasantly surprised at how enjoyable it ended up becoming for me. But before we get to that, there are a few problems that I have with the game, some pretty severe issues that would prevent me from replaying it that much. I do think I would replay it in the future though, and that's not exactly something I can say for a lot of recent Sonic games, so keep that in mind. Back to negatives though, I guess I'll start with the story. It's better than every game post Unleashed, though that's not really saying much. I think that the main problem is that they just don't really go any further than the surface layer, and even in certain spots it feels like they don't even get partway through the surface layer. I like individual elements, like Tails deciding that he needs to strike it out on his own so that he can mature and not rely on Sonic so much, but then Amy and Knuckles don't really get that much to do other than occasionally talk to Sonic and help these Korok knockoff things. And the history of these Korok knockoff things is also something I would have liked to have been explored more, since the minute and a half that we did get was actually somewhat intriguing. Breath of the Wild has a minimal focus on story, but it was pretty clear based on Link's memories in the landscape of Hyrule that you could infer what happened 100 years ago. And while Tears of the Kingdom doesn't really explain too much more about the past of the Zonai, it does still give a bit more of an idea of their role in the world. I still have no idea what the deal with his tribe is or what these islands are. I know the Titans were designed to contain the evil thing, that's also unexplained. I like Eggman for the first time since Unleashed, which is a pattern that I think you can really start to see here. Sonic really did peak as a franchise there. Sage is fine, I guess. I think that she's by far the most interesting new character in the game, and I really would have liked if they developed the father-daughter relationship between her and Eggman more, since it would actually be pretty wholesome and lead to a more bittersweet ending with the two. I guess what I'm getting at is that there's a lot of missed potential here. Unlike Forces though, it does feel like they actually did some things with it, even if they could have gone further with it, as opposed to doing literally nothing. The core gameplay loop is repetitive and lacks a lot of variation. This isn't a problem in itself, most games have a simple gameplay loop that they base the entire game around. But when only 2 of the 4 primary islands have fun level design, it does mean that the game drags a bit, especially on the 5th island. The 2nd island is a big desert and it feels incredibly empty. There is so little to do. You also get Knuckles medals way too easily, so there's not a ton of exploration to get some, meaning it's a lot of running back and forth without engaging with too much. The 5th island feels too similar to the 1st with far less interesting design, and I found myself getting way more burned out on the game by this point. Across all 4 of the major islands is a lot of menial busy work that feels more like an excuse to do something rather than a justifiable reason to engage with the game. I guess one of the reasons for this is because a lot of the rewards that you can get for running around the islands can be bought from tokens that you get while fishing. Fishing is one of those things I've never understood the appeal for in games. I've grown to appreciate it more in the real world, but in games I have better things to do. To be fair, it is one of the less stupid fishing minigames, with you needing to press A when the red circle intersects with the white one. I actually kinda like it for a bit, but it becomes repetitive real quick. But it is by far the most efficient way to get portal keys, vault keys, memory tokens, skill points, you name it. Why fight a mini boss or a group of tough enemies when the reward just nets you something you can get from fishing for a couple of minutes? Why try to do sweet air tricks so you can quite easily max out your skill tree by the time you get off of the 1st island with the help of your good friend Big the Cat? Technically, there's a system in place preventing you from doing this. You need to spend purple coins in order to fish, and how many tokens you get to buy all the things you need to progress through the game isn't always guaranteed to be high, plus the further into the game you get, the more coins it costs to fish. The problem here though is that it is way too easy to hoard purple coins. I had hundreds just by playing through the game casually. In fact, I had so many that I legitimately forgot about them and had to go add them into this part of the script later. That's how many they shower you with. I don't even really know how you get purple coins, and yet I still had far more than I could ever spend. And all this is assuming you can even find the dang place. Unless you happen to unlock the exact map tile it's located at, you'll just end up spending a bunch of time wandering around the island trying to find it since there isn't enough to differentiate it from other structures. And by you, I mean me, because I don't actually know if you personally would do that. I am the idiot who kinda likes the werehog stages, so that already kinda invalidates my opinion. Another thing that can make going through the game an absolute chore are the mini games that you have to play throughout the story. Some are decently fun, like this one with the ship where you have to destroy stuff with either a white or black laser depending on the color. But then you have every single one dedicated to the Korok knockoff things, and I hate each one of them with a special kind of apathy and lack of tolerance like you wouldn't believe. It's like the sheep wrangling from Mario Odyssey, which is also one of the worst parts of that game. The pinball game sucks too, and it doesn't make it obvious enough that once you get all of the points you need, that you then need to get the ball to the top, so I left the game thinking it was done, meaning I had to relive the pain all over again. It was quite obnoxious. Another thing that left a bad taste in my mouth afterwards was the ending. Up until that point, the game didn't really feel like it was unfinished, which is truly an amazing accomplishment if I'm being honest with you. But the ending is so underwhelming that I have no choice but to believe that it was the product of having to hit a deadline. The final fight is really easy and it doesn't even feel like it's supposed to be the final fight. I remember thinking that it was just a build up to it, and then you go to space, I'm thinking, oh yeah, this is when we get to the true final boss. Just need to press these buttons real quick and we'll begin the fight. Oh, it's over. Well, that was lame. While editing this section, I noticed that the footage I was using showed an actual final boss, which confused me because it definitely wasn't there when I played the game. It turns out that if you're playing on easy difficulty or normal difficulty like I was, then you don't even get the actual final boss. This is one of the stupidest, most frustrating, utterly baffling things I've ever seen in any Sonic game in the entire series. Why didn't they just make an easier variation of this for the non-hard mode difficulty options? Why is it limited to quick time events? I swear this better not happen with the next release. I don't think that the ending is the most important part of a game, but it does tend to stick with me after my first playthrough. Games like Mario Odyssey, Twilight Princess, and Tears of the Kingdom I have very fond fond memories of when I first beat them, because the ending of each of these games are these really unique and bombastic set pieces. In fact, it honestly feels like an apt comparison. Playing as Bowser as you escape the crumbling interior of the moon while an epic, gloriously cheesy song plays in the background, compared to one of the weakest Titan fights in the game, followed by a few button prompts while Sonic kinda just does a thing, I guess. It's such a disappointing nothingness. Also, the reason that it's an apt comparison is because the moon. But hands down, the biggest problem with Sonic Frontiers are the cyber levels. On paper, the idea doesn't seem too bad. Level structure like the boost formula games that you have to complete in order to access the Chaos Emeralds. In order to unlock them, you need to explore the overworld for gears to access them. It seems like a fun little system. The execution is pretty not great though. They're all just lazily taken from previous games. I saw a comparison to Throwback Galaxy from Super Mario Galaxy 2 before the game's release, and it irks me because these are two completely different scenarios. In Galaxy 2, Thwomp's Fortress is remade from the ground up, specifically taking the basic design and basing it around Galaxy 2 rather than 64. They didn't remake any of the levels specifically for Frontiers, it is literally just the exact same level designs as before. And since Sonic controls differently than he did in the games that the levels were designed for, it means that they all feel pretty awkward to play now. Part of me wants to give it a pass since more development time went into designing the islands, but the other part of me recognizes that the cyber levels are a key part of the game's core loop. A loop that is practically meaningless anyway since you can bypass it with a fishing minigame. It upsets me so much because I can't help but feel that they were a massive missed opportunity. Imagine how cool it would have been if they all had this distinct, glitchy look with similar level design as previous Sonic games, but not exactly the same, just like how our memories of events and whatnot are an absolute accurate account of what happened. They could have been built around Frontier's control scheme and just been a fun platforming challenge that is completely distinct from the platforming found outside of them. This would not only make them actually fun to go through, they would also strengthen the core gameplay loop, therefore easily making this the third best 3D Sonic game behind Adventure 2 and Unleashed. Yes, I do like Unleashed that much, it's why I keep bringing it up. All these things I mentioned in this section ultimately hold the game back from being as good as it could be, which is a shame because the stuff I like in this game is some of the best stuff to come out of the series in a long time. The game is vastly different to what came before, and I'm so grateful that the Sonic team was willing to experiment with Sonic again. Not everything it does works, but this section is dedicated to what does work. Firstly, this is the first time since Adventure 2 that I can say with confidence that I love how Sonic feels in a 3D game. Sure, there's no real momentum, but outside of that, everything is pretty perfect. It's just fun to run around and do the platforming challenges, specifically the ones actually designed around his movement in the game. The skill tree is a fun idea, and it does make combat surprisingly engaging, at least for a Sonic game. Moving between the different attacks is fairly seamless, and as you progress through the game, the combat gets more fun. I do think that locking everything behind a skill tree is a little weird. It feels like a needless form of progression. I think the game would be more fun, especially on repeat playthroughs, if you had all of the major abilities unlocked from the beginning, especially because combat isn't fun in the slightest without these abilities. Outside of the cyber levels, I think that the platforming is actually fairly solid, if you're willing to ignore the awful 2D sections, which if you accidentally get stuck in, you have to awkwardly turn around for some reason instead of being able to just move to the side. They don't feel naturally implemented into the world, it's all arbitrarily decided to just be a 2D section. With that said, the other platforming is solid. Going through them offers the Sonic feel that makes the series so appealing to me, and the 3 best islands are great in large part because of them. I like how they also employ 64's earlier level design philosophy of the main punishment for screwing up being falling down rather than death or whatever. It really fits the open zone vibe. The second island's platforming feels a little too spread out, and again, since you get so many Knuckles medals from just running around, it doesn't feel justified going out of your way to do it. And the fifth island just doesn't have a ton interesting to it. Back to the actual platforming though, I'm not the biggest fan of how it's integrated into the world, just kind of being plastered there. Like, these towers feel naturally ingrained into the world, Squid also feels natural, but everything else feels like they needed a platforming area here, so they placed it there. Not terrible or anything, but it definitely doesn't feel synergized. The 3 islands I enjoy have a bit more than just good platforming, even if said platforming is their best attribute. Actually, I take that back, the 4th island is literally just platforming up some towers, though it's also my favorite section of the entire game. The platforming is just on point here, each one is exhilarating in a way that the series hasn't been able to capture since Unleashed. It's also just really satisfying to make your way to the top of them. The 1st and 3rd islands are the ones that are enjoyable for reasons other than the platforming. They're both actually kind of fun to explore, the 3rd island being the best execution of exploration in the whole game. The 1st island acts as a good tutorial, though when I played the game for the first time I was really worried because it took over an hour to really get into the game. Ironically, Sonic Frontiers has a slow start. But once I started to get into it, it just clicked. This 1st island is a really good blend of everything the game has to offer, solid platforming, exploration, and the little puzzles scattered throughout the map. Though I'll talk about those in a bit. Honestly, it's a little disappointing that no other island in the game really managed to combine these elements as good as this first one. The second one isn't fun to explore, the fourth island is literally only platforming, and the fifth one kinda has all these elements, well they're at their weakest here. The third one has an okay balance, which I'll take as it's better than nothing. Now before I make my next point, I think it's important to note that I am an idiot, a clearly demonstrable fact. I found that a big part of why I enjoyed the third island is because I was constantly thinking to myself how on earth I would manage to get over to some of the Chaos Emeralds. Having to find the way to get across to the isolated islands provided a very fun exploration-based challenge, which is honestly not something I can say I was expecting before playing it. The way the map works is also something I found myself liking, which surprised me. Before release, I knew that there would be these puzzle things apparently, but I asked myself how that would actually work in the game because high-speed platforming and bite-sized Korok-esque puzzles don't really mesh that well on paper, but somehow they did it. With the exception of the fourth island, you'll receive a blank map, and going to these puzzle locations will unlock squares on the map, which is a surprisingly natural way of implementing this idea into a Sonic game. Granted, not all of them are winners, like this one where you hit the bumpers on your controller, but a lot of the other things they ask you to do are a pretty fun distraction. I do wish that they unlocked a bit more of the map, and sometimes the holes that it leaves behind is incredibly unsatisfying, but outside of that I think they're implemented into the game about as perfectly as they could have been. The Titan battles are the last thing I have anything to say about. One of the ideas cut from 06 that's always bugged me to no end was the idea that Super Sonic wouldn't be locked behind the final fight, but would be something that you'd have to engage with multiple times throughout the game. And Frontiers actually took that idea and did something with it. The Titan battles are all these cool spectacles, and it felt good to have a Sonic game just pump me up again. They aren't particularly challenging, the only one I struggled with was the first one, and that's only because I had no idea what I was doing. But despite that, I always looked forward to the next one because they're really strong set pieces. I will say that none of them really stand out in my mind individually, kinda like the Blights from Breath of the Wild. Though the elemental theming did a lot to make them distinct in that game, the Titans don't really have too much that makes me think about a specific one. The closest is the second one since you have to chase it in the air, which is pretty fun. I have no idea how to transition to the conclusion of the video. There's stuff I didn't mention in this video, and that's because I don't have particularly strong feelings on it either way. The side loop is kinda neat, I guess. The mini bosses are a mixed bag, some are fun and some are really not fun. For this particular video, I just wanted to focus on the things I have a strong opinion on. I am beyond pleased that the Sonic team are willing to take a big risk with Sonic again, that they ended up releasing a game that a lot of fans ended up really loving. It was nice seeing people talking positive about a Sonic game again. My feelings are a little more conflicted. There's stuff in here I really like, but the stuff I don't like is similar to the typical Sonic schlock I've become accustomed to. But at the end of the day, that really doesn't matter, because there was an idea here, an idea to try and make a Sonic game unlike what was seen in the series before. It didn't live up to all of its ambitious ideas, but it's comforting to know that the Sonic team hasn't completely given up on going further than where Sonic is expected to go. Let's just hope that this ambition sticks around for future entries to come.